An accident on the motorway, every driver's nightmare. The severity of the crash strongly depends on the roadside restraint systems. Will they be able to minimize the damage as much as possible? Crash tests help establish whether a barrier made of steel or of concrete is up to the task. In Germany, it is the duty of the manufacturers to carry out such tests to prove that their products meet all the legal requirements. A certified crash test center in northern Germany. A unique test series is about to start here in just a few minutes. This time, a federation of manufacturers won't be testing their own products, but those of their competitors. For this purpose, the German Association of Steel Crash Barrier Manufacturers has arranged for the construction of a concrete barrier that can be found on hundreds of kilometers of German motorways. Why?
First, we want a direct comparison of steel and concrete systems. Second, the wall we tested there is officially categorized in the medium impact severity level B. And we always had our doubts as to whether that was correct.
Steel or concrete? Which system is safer? Which material cheaper? While driving on German motorways, it's hard to imagine that the issue of roadside restraint systems has been fueling a bitter dispute for years. Professor Ulf Zander of Siegen University has been following this dogmatic war of words for some time now and doesn't understand why one specific criterion is constantly neglected.
It's about protecting the driver's life, so passenger safety is of course a major argument for supporting and choosing one of the two systems. This should also take priority when awarding contracts, as stipulated by the existing regulations.
The preparations for the first crash at the test centre are almost completed. The test series comprises 4 vehicle classes, starting with the most common model size. The saloon car hits the rigid concrete at 110 km per hour.
The vehicle drives into the concrete barrier at a very high speed, turns sideways and lifts off the ground, covering about 10 meters, during which any steering is impossible, before touching down again uncontrolledly.
What's crucial here is the time the vehicle spends in the air.
The amount of energy reduced here is rather minor, which means if the vehicle hits the wall at 110 km per hour, it carries on flying at 110. It might be a few k's less at this spot, but that's negligible. You can't brake in the air.
So what happens to the passengers during the crash?
The footage from inside the car shows how the entire body and head are accelerated towards the driver's door. The head hits and breaks the window. You can see the glass fragments flying through the car. Naturally, a far from reassuring outcome.
What happens to the passengers is measured in the crash test and defined with the so-called impact severity level, ranging from level A, very good, to C, only partly recommendable. Although this concrete barrier was awarded the B grade by the manufacturer, in the test, it only achieved C with great difficulty.
An impact severity level of C, of course, means mortal danger, not just because of the direct injuries sustained, but also because the vehicle is disabled by the crash and therefore completely helpless in the face of any other traffic. It is our core principle to try and achieve the severity impact level A for all our systems. B systems should be the exception, and C systems shouldn't be built at all, really. But if you look at Germany's motorways, you'll find a somewhat different reality.
The same test, only this time it's an estate car crashing against a steel system.
Hier beim Anprall an die Stahlschutzplanke sieht man.
Here, in the collision with the steel crash barrier, you can see how the protective system deforms immediately upon impact. Every centimeter of deformation helps the barrier absorb energy and reduce the vehicle's velocity. Deformation is exactly what we want to see in such tests. We have material damage in the vehicle's crash zone, which is nothing to worry about. The whole front end is dispensable as long as the driver isn't injured or, at the very least, survives the crash test.
By the way, this steel crash barrier passed the test with the impact severity level A.
Systems should yield, have to yield, if you want to increase road safety. But it's still the case today that our clients often ignore this impact severity level or the rigidity of a system.
A small passenger car hitting a concrete barrier first of all suffers considerable damage to the bodywork. But then, something else happens too.
The vehicle fails to stay in the lane after impact. You can see how it's gradually turning away from the concrete barrier. The car's rear is significantly elevated, which of course precludes any steering.
And this is crucial. When hitting a steel crash barrier, the crash zone initially also suffers considerable damage.
On the whole, the vehicle performs rather well, though. It does still leave the lane, but you can't see it lifting off the ground or losing maneuverability.
SUVs are very popular these days, not least because they convey a sense of safety. And to begin with, this is confirmed when crashing against concrete.
It would appear there's very little damage, but there's a significant acceleration of the vehicle. And as you can see rather well in this sequence, the rear is lifted up very high. All four wheels are off the ground and the vehicle flies several meters before touching down again, and it's still at a very high speed.
The real-time footage proves just how fast the SUV still is after impact. The difference to crashing against steel is clearly visible.
The SUV,
a very rigid construction, hits the steel crash barrier, which deforms immediately. You can see clearly that the vehicle suffers hardly any damage thanks to its rigidity. And the car once again remains in the lane rather well. It doesn't lift off. It takes its share of damage, but for the passengers, this accident is certainly tolerable.
Delivery vans are ubiquitous on our motorways, and often they travel at quite a pace. They also have a high centre of mass, which doesn't go unpunished when crashing into a concrete barrier.
The impact is severe and jerks the vehicle upward. It lands on its side and skids down the road at a very high speed, ultimately crashing into the tire barrier with considerable force. You can see how much energy is still left in the vehicle.
The collision with the steel crash barrier also almost overturns the vehicle.
The high center of mass, of course, implies a lateral inclination. The steel crash barrier absorbs that here and the vehicle rebounds very shakily, but it stays on the road to a large extent. Now the driver can also use the brakes because the vehicle is back on the ground. It also remains in the traffic lane.
Conclusion. With regard to passenger safety, steel crash barriers are clearly superior to concrete systems. But doesn't this in turn mean disadvantages when it comes to really large vehicles?
This test shows that a steel crash barrier is also capable of stopping 38-ton juggernauts. The construction doesn't break, deforms markedly, and absorbs the energy, which also leads to the vehicle being guided onwards directly along the steel crash barrier.
Geleitet wird.
And this effectively refutes one of the main arguments against steel. Steel crash barriers can hold back the heaviest and largest of vehicles. By the way, the concrete barrier used in these crash tests is no longer officially recommended for construction, and yet it can still be found on far too many stretches of motorway.